Russian President Vladimir Putin is all set to visit India tomorrow for a high-stakes bilateral summit with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. At the heart of this visit is a newly finalized agreement on the mobility of skilled and semi-skilled workers. Indian Ministry of External Affairs officials said that the document has been finalized and is going through internal processes before signing. Economic cooperation will be a key focus during this summit, and bilateral trade has crossed $65 billion between India and Russia and is driven largely by India's import of discounted Russian crude. Now, in spite of all of this, the relationship remains heavily tilted in Moscow's favor. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who held a press conference recently, acknowledged India's concerns, saying that Moscow wants to buy more from India and is looking for joint efforts to correct this imbalance. India is pushing for wider access for its marine products, pharmaceuticals, processed food, consumer goods, potatoes, pomegranates, with both sides, India and Russia, agreeing to work towards narrowing the trade deficit. Despite US President Donald Trump imposing tariffs on New Delhi for importing Russian crude oil, Dmitry Peskov expressed optimism about longer-term ambitions with India. On the energy front, Moscow says supplies to India remain stable despite all the sanctions imposed by the US. India reiterated that private companies make oil purchase decisions based on global market conditions. New Delhi is expanding its footprint in Russia with consulates in Kazan and soon Yekaterinburg, alongside negotiations for a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union as well. Now, during the bilateral summit between the two leaders, talks may also include an additional S-400 missile system. The air defense systems that India already owns and were also in use during Operation Sindoor. More of these may be discussed, and discussions on New Delhi's interest in the Su-57 fifth-generation fighter jet, which Russia has fully offered, which the Kremlin spokesperson called the best plane in the world. Civil nuclear cooperation is also going to be discussed, including compact reactor technology. And additionally, the two leaders are likely to discuss issues related to terrorism and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Now, just hours ahead of Putin's arrival, Russia's State Duma approved the Reciprocal Exchange of Logistics Support Pact, RELOS. Signed earlier this year, RELOS allows military aircraft, ships, personnel from both countries, India and Russia, to use each other's facilities for exercises, training, humanitarian missions, and disaster relief. The Russian president praised Russia's rapidly growing trade with India and said he would continue pursuing a sovereign economic policy.
We
will continue to pursue a sovereign economic policy and act externally based on our own national interests, the needs of domestic businesses and our citizens. We will fulfill our obligations to foreign partners and expand cooperation with those countries that are interested in it. As I have already said, the vast majority of countries act rationally and pragmatically. Over the past 3 years, we have significantly increased.
Now, Putin is set to visit India for the first time since the Ukraine war began in 2022. And that visit is scheduled for the 4th and 5th of December. That's tomorrow and day after. As Putin and Prime Minister Modi, they've set their eyes to boost bilateral ties in New Delhi. US, of course, is going to be watching all the developments very closely, and not just the US capitals across the West will have their eyes on the developments in New Delhi over the course of the next 48 hours. All right, now joining me on Point and Counterpoint for more on this, I'm going to be interacting with former Indian diplomat Anil Trigunath from New Delhi, and I'll also be joined by John Edith, who's here with us, Senior Policy Director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, joining us from Geneva. Ambassador Trigunath, let me start with you. Is there a tightrope that India needs to walk as it navigates US and Russia? Can India maintain its historic Russian ties while deepening economic and strategic ties with the US?
Well, at the outset, I would like to discount the fact that India is doing any tightrope walking. It is called strategic autonomy and multi-alignment. We have always chosen that path since independence, if you remember, and it has continued all through. And India does not compromise on its sovereign choice. It wants to maintain good relations. It has a global comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States. It also has a special and privileged strategic partnership which is trusted and time tested with Russia. So I don't think that there is any conflict in that. As far as the certain issues are concerned, India has taken a principled viewpoint, especially if we were to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. We definitely did not condemn it, but we did not endorse either the Russian action. At the same time, Prime Minister Modi has been talking about how to end this war. He has personally gone around, and this was appreciated by whole West, in fact, the European countries as well as the United States, that India was doing enough, and it's the only country that can go and talk to both sides simultaneously. So this is what it provides you. So I don't think that there is any tightrope walking. As far as relations with Russia are concerned and President Putin's visit is concerned, I think it's a highly significant and a substantive visit, especially when we see the global churn and very quick turnarounds by certain partners that we have.
Understood. Ambassador Trigunath, stay with me. Let me go over to John Edith. John, you believe that India eventually will be forced to choose a side when it comes to either coming towards the US or staying on with Russia. Give us more on what your perspective is. You've heard what Ambassador Trigunath had to say.
I agree with the ambassador in that India is not so much walking a tightrope as India is mapping its own policy based on its own sovereign interests. This is what India has always done and what it will continue to do in the future. That said, if the war is coming to an end, if there's a possibility of peace, India may have to choose which side it will be on in terms of whether it will pressure Russia to accept less than Putin is demanding, or whether it will pressure Ukraine to make territorial concessions. This is yet to be determined. We're going to see. I think the visit of President Putin to India will be highly significant in this regard.
Understood. John, stay with me. Ambassador Trigunath, and John still mentions that maybe not a tightrope, but eventually a side will need to be chosen. Let me come a little further from there. India's Russian oil imports, they fell by nearly a third after additional tariffs for buying Russian oil were imposed and stringent sanctions on key Russian oil exporters. Analysts also expect further declines of these oil imports from Russia going forward in the months of December and the months to come. But Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, he said that it's temporary. What do you make of this regarding India's balancing act, and does India risk more penalties with the potential of acquisition of more Russian arms?
Well, as I can see it and I read it, I don't think that there is going to be any more penalties. We are discussing bilateral trade agreement, which is quite very much on the final stages with the United States. India has also diversified its imports, including from the United States. In fact, the import of gas from the United States has gone up by about 120%, if I remember correctly. We are also buying a lot of equipment from the United States and other Western countries. So it is not as far as that is concerned. One should remember that basic purpose of any foreign policy is to serve your national interest. India imports about 80% of its energy requirements, and therefore we'll get it from wherever we could. You remember then when the Russia-Ukraine war began, the Europeans placed sanctions and they stopped importing Russian gas to that extent, and they started forcing the Gulf countries, which were our traditional suppliers, to divert there. On the other hand, with Russia, which is not a sanctioned commodity, by the way, it is a capped commodity, so we continued to import as per the cap that was there. And then you have President Trump taking a very unusual view about that. I mean, the same thing they are importing, they are trading with the Russians. Everything that they want, they're getting it from there. Today, 51% of the gas is still coming from Russia. So billions of dollars are being pumped into Russia by the West themselves. On the other hand, China is the major partner. They will not choose them for sanctions, but they chose India for additional 25% sanction. This is the hypocrisy and double standards that India denounces. And I don't think it is going to succumb, as far as I can read. India is not going to succumb to any pressure. There are going to be costs, and there are costs, and we are ready to pay them.
There are costs, we are ready to pay them, but India is not going to succumb. Ambassador Trigunath, that's where you leave it. Let me come to John now. John, if I become a little more specific here, does India risk more penalties or catch-up penalties with the potential acquisition of more Russian arms? Because that threat came from the US a little earlier. The waiver was given under the Biden administration, but the threat came under the previous Trump administration. What's the possibility of that happening as of now?
I think that it is certainly a possibility. It's very hard to predict what the Trump administration will say or do on a given day or a given issue. They have used the threat of sanctions and economic pressure before and may decide to do so again. So it is certainly a possibility that there could be sanctions placed on India for further acquisitions of Russian weapons. The real issue, though, is what is India getting for its money? What we're seeing is that the Russian weapons are performing very poorly in Ukraine compared to some of those supplied by Western counterparts. So India would be well advised to be careful and make sure that it is getting a favorable deal on the equipment it is purchasing from Russia.
Understood, John, but also to remind everyone that the S-400s were very much in use during Operation Sindoor and they performed brilliantly for India. But what India decides, of course, will be in the hands of the leadership. We'll know in the next 2 days what all comes out. Big thank you to John Edith and Ambassador Trigunath for joining us here on Point Counterpoint.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.